Welcome back to the NeuroSpicy MomPod. As always, I'm your host, Austin Marie, and I am so happy you're here. If you're new around here, this is the little corner of the internet where we explore neuroscience, psychology, neurodivergence, parenting, healing, and all of the messy, complicated ways those things show up in real life. My goal is not to just help you understand how your brain works, but to help you understand yourself with a little more compassion. Because when we understand our nervous systems, our stories, and the systems we've been shaped by, we can start making choices from a place of awareness instead of survival. So, whether you're folding laundry, sitting in the school pickup line, cleaning the kitchen, driving to work, or hiding in your bathroom for 5 minutes of peace and quiet, I'm really glad you're spending this time here with me. A few days ago, I was sitting at the park watching my kids play when I overheard a mother talking to her toddler. I do not know her story. I don't know what kind of day she was having, and I don't know how much support she has or how much sleep she got the night before or what burdens that she might be carrying that nobody else can see. But I did hear her say, "Stop it right now. You're being such a bad little girl." And my heart just sank. Not because I think that mother is a bad person or that I think she doesn't love her child. Honestly, I think most parents have probably said something they wish they could take back at one point or another. I know I certainly have. And I spend a lot of time as a parent repairing my relationship with my kids. Parenting is hard. Being human is hard. What broke my heart was knowing that that little girl probably will not remember that specific day, or she won't remember what she was doing or why she was in trouble, but she will remember the feeling. And if she hears those messages often enough, eventually they stop sounding like someone else's voice and they start sounding like her own. That moment stayed with me for a few days because it reminded me of something I spent years thinking about as a teacher, long before I was hosting this podcast and before I understood my own neurodivergence. One of the things I was most intentional about in my classroom was language, not just what I said to children, but how I said it. The words we use matter. The stories that we repeat matter. The messages children hear over and over again matter. And today I want to talk about why. I want to talk about the science of language, the psychology of identity, the stories that we inherit, the beliefs that we internalize, and why I genuinely believe words are one of the most powerful forces shaping our lives. Because whether you approach this conversation through neuroscience, psychology, education, spirituality, or a little bit of all of the above, I think they are all pointing us towards the same truth. The words we hear repeatedly become the stories we tell ourselves, and those stories eventually become the lens through which we experience the world. Creating my very own classroom was one of the most meaningful responsibilities I have ever been given. I understood that for many of my students, they would spend more waking hours with me during the week than they would with their own families. That reality was never lost on me. I knew I had an opportunity to be a positive influence in their lives if I was intentional about the environment I created. One of the ways I did that was by creating a strong sense of community within the classroom. Every classroom had a theme. My very first class was safari themed, and we were the first grade explorers. When I later moved into transitional kindergarten, I inherited a beautiful hungry caterpillar classroom, and we became the TK pillars because we were hungry for learning. It might sound silly to some people, but these little traditions gave students a sense of belonging. They created a shared identity and helped children feel connected to something bigger than themselves. At the beginning of every school year, we created a social contract together. We talked about how we wanted to be treated and how we wanted to treat others. We discussed expected behaviors and unexpected behaviors. Then every student signed the contract, even if that signature was nothing more than a little scribble. It was our collective agreement about the kind of community we wanted to create together. The classroom was also intentionally structured so students knew exactly what to expect. We had visual schedules posted on the wall that we reviewed every morning together. We sang the same songs during transitions. We practiced the same routines over and over again until students could practically run the classrooms themselves. In fact, one of the student jobs in my classroom was helping lead our morning meeting by pointing to the visual schedule and reviewing the day with the class. And honestly, that ended up being incredibly important because life happened. I was a mom. There were sick kids and doctor appointments, family emergencies, and all of the unpredictable things that come with being human. I was fortunate to have incredible student teachers, aides, and substitute teachers who helped keep things running smoothly. But the reason they could do that was because the classroom systems were bigger than any one adult. The students knew the routines, they knew the songs, they knew what came next. We had songs about emotions. We had songs about kindness. We had songs about boundaries and body autonomy. One of my favorites was the Boundary Song, which you can still find on YouTube. And honestly, I highly recommend adding it to your school drop off playlist. The students loved it, but more importantly, they were hearing messages every single day about consent, respect, and personal agency. At the time, I thought I was building a classroom culture. Looking back now, I realize I was doing something much bigger than that because none of those systems were actually about classroom management. They were not about control. They were not about creating perfectly behaved little robots who sat quietly and followed directions. Everything I did was rooted in a belief that children are constantly learning who they are. And whether we realize it or not, the adults around them play a tremendous role in shaping that answer. That is why I was so intentional about language in my classroom. Looking back now, I realized some people probably thought I was being overly particular or making a bigger deal out of the words than was necessary, but I genuinely believed that the way adults spoke to children mattered, not because I expected perfection from myself or anyone else, but because children are constantly absorbing information about themselves and the world around them long before they have the ability to question whether those messages are true. Because of that, I was very mindful about the language we used in the classroom. We did not call children lazy. We did not call them bad. We did not label them as difficult, manipulative, dramatic, attention seeking, or troublemakers. We talked about behaviors, choices, emotions, and skills. And we were careful not to confuse a child's behavior with their identity because those are two very different things. One of the simplest examples of this was how we gave directions. Instead of constantly telling students what not to do, we tried to tell them what we wanted them to do instead. So rather than saying, no running, we would say, walking feet. Rather than saying, stop yelling, we might say, let's use a classroom voice. It sounds like such a small difference, but I always felt that it was important because one statement gives a child a picture of what success looks like, while the other simply tells them what they are doing wrong. Experts estimate that children with ADHD hear up to 5 to 8 more negative or corrective statements every single day than their neurotypical peers. Over the course of a childhood, this results in an estimated 20,000 more negative messages by the time they reach ages 10 to 12. The same thing was true when it came to praise. Because of my background in psychology, growth mindset was important to me, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to encourage effort rather than attaching a child's worth to a particular outcome. Instead of telling a student they were smart, I would often tell them that I noticed how hard they worked, how they kept trying when something felt difficult, or how they were willing to learn from their mistakes. I wanted them to understand that their value did not come from getting everything right. Their value came from being human, and learning was simply part of that process. And we always made sure to celebrate growth. In fact, one of the most influential researchers in this area is psychologist Carol Dweck, whose work on growth mindset found that the way adults praise children can significantly influence how they respond to challenges and setbacks later on. Children who are consistently praised for being smart often become more afraid of making mistakes because mistakes begin to threaten their identity. Meanwhile, children who are praised for effort, persistence, and problem solving are more likely to view mistakes as part of the learning rather than evidence that something is wrong with them. And honestly, once I learned that research, I could never unsee it. Because when you spend years working with children, you start noticing that they are constantly trying to answer a question that most of them cannot yet articulate. Who am I? Every interaction with a parent, a teacher, coach, sibling, or caregiver becomes a tiny piece of evidence that helps them construct that answer. If a child repeatedly hears that they are thoughtful, capable, resilient, and kind, those messages begin to form the foundation of how they see themselves. If a child repeatedly hears that they are lazy, dramatic, selfish, difficult, or too much, those messages can become part of their identity as well. Not because children are irrational, but because children are doing exactly what human brains are designed to do. They are looking for patterns. They are creating narratives. They are building an understanding of themselves based on the information available to them. What is even more fascinating is that neuroscience suggests our brains are constantly strengthening the pathways that we use most often. There is a phrase in neuroscience that says neurons that fire together wire together. In simple terms, the more often a thought, belief, or emotional response is activated, the easier it becomes for the brain to access that pathway in the future. Over time, certain beliefs become so familiar that they stop feeling like beliefs at all and simply start feeling like facts. And if that sounds dramatic, I would encourage you to think about the voice that lives inside your own head. Most of us can immediately identify a criticism that we have repeated to ourselves for years. Maybe it's that you are not good enough. Maybe it's that you are lazy. Maybe it's that you are too sensitive or that you're too emotional, too needy, too loud, too much, or somehow not enough at all at the same time. Whatever the message is, I would be willing to bet that very few of us invented those stories on our own. We learned them from somewhere. We heard them enough times that eventually they stopped sounding like someone else's opinion and started sounding like the truth. What is interesting to me now is that at the time, I thought all of these classroom practices were for the students. And obviously they were. I wanted my students to feel safe. I wanted them to feel capable. And I wanted them to understand that making mistakes was part of learning and that struggling with something did not mean that they were failing. I wanted them to know that they had autonomy over their own bodies, that they could set boundaries, and that their worth as a person was not determined by how productive they were or how perfectly they performed. But somewhere along the way, those lessons started boomeranging back and hitting me directly in the face. Because while I was spending my days teaching children about growth mindset, I was still carrying around a lot of beliefs about myself that I had never really examined. I had spent years teaching children that mistakes were how we learn. But if I am being honest, I was still treating many of my own mistakes as evidence that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. I could extend compassion and understanding to a 6-year-old who was learning a new skill, but somehow struggled to offer that same grace to myself as a grown adult. And I do not think that I'm alone in that. The longer I have been on this healing journey, the more I have realized how many of us are carrying around beliefs that feel like objective truth when they're really just stories that we've heard over and over again. For years, I genuinely believed I was too sensitive, not occasionally sensitive, not sometimes too sensitive, just too sensitive. And because I believed that, every time something hurt my feelings, every time I felt overwhelmed, or every time I had an emotional reaction to something, I interpreted it through that lens. Instead of asking whether my feelings made sense, I immediately assumed the problem was me. The fascinating thing about the human brain is that once we adopt a belief, we become incredibly good at finding evidence to support it. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as confirmation bias, which is our tendency to notice, remember, and prioritize information that supports our existing beliefs while overlooking information that contradicts them. So, if I believed I was too sensitive, my brain became very efficient at collecting proof. Every disagreement, every misunderstanding, every criticism became proof. Meanwhile, all of the evidence suggesting that perhaps my feelings made perfect sense given the circumstances rarely received the same attention. The reality is that human beings are meaning making creatures. We are constantly trying to create coherent stories about who we are and how the world works. The problem is some of those stories help us grow and some of those stories keep us trapped. What I find so fascinating is that the same research that explains why children benefit from positive, intentional language also helps explain why so many adults struggle to break free from harmful beliefs about themselves. The brain does not particularly care whether a story is true. The brain cares whether a story is familiar. And familiarity can be incredibly powerful, sometimes so powerful that we would rather cling to a painful story we have known for 30 years than risk believing something kinder. So, where does that leave us? Well, according to the research, our brains remain capable of change throughout our lives. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to form new neural pathways and strengthen different patterns of thinking over time. In other words, the stories we have repeated for years may feel permanent, but they are not necessarily permanent. And honestly, I find that incredibly comforting. Many of us have inherited stories that we have never consciously chose. Some of us inherited stories about our worth. Some of us inherited stories about our intelligence or our bodies, our emotions, or our productivity, our relationships, or our place in the world. And because those stories arrived early and because they were repeated often, they settled into our nervous system and started feeling like reality. But familiarity is not the same thing as truth. And that distinction has probably been one of the most healing things I have ever learned. Once I stopped asking whether a belief felt true and started asking whether it was actually accurate, everything begins to shift. Instead of automatically assuming I was lazy, I started to become curious about what might be making that task difficult. Instead of immediately concluding that I was too emotional, I started considering whether my feelings made perfect sense given the circumstances. Instead of treating every mistake as evidence that I was failing, I started experimenting with the radical idea that maybe I was simply being a human being having a human experience, which, as it turns out, is what a lot of us are doing. And when I say words are magic, I'm not talking about pretending reality does not exist. I'm talking about the fact that words shape perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes, and outcomes eventually become the reality we experience. Neuroscience has language for this. Psychology has its language for this, and spiritual traditions have their own language for this. But they are all describing variations of the same phenomenon. The stories we repeat matter. The stories we tell our children and the stories we tell ourselves matter. If I have learned anything from teaching, parenting, surviving burnout, leaving unhealthy relationships, navigating late discovered neurodivergence, and generally stumbling my way through adulthood, is that we become very good at believing whatever we hear often enough, which means we also have the opportunity to become more intentional about what we choose to repeat. Not because we are trying to gaslight ourselves into toxic positivity or because we are trying to pretend that everything is fine when it's clearly not, but because we deserve narratives that are honest and nuanced and compassionate rather than narratives that are rooted in shame. Shame has spent centuries masquerading as wisdom. And frankly, I think it is time we start questioning its credentials. And maybe that is where the healing begins, not with finding the perfect affirmation or forcing ourselves to think positive thoughts 24 hours a day, but with becoming curious enough to ask whether the stories we are carrying are actually true. And if they are not, perhaps we can begin writing new ones. Before we go, I want to leave you with this week's journal prompt. When I make a mistake, what is the first thing I automatically say to myself? And whose voice does it sound like? As always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please make sure you're following the NeuroSpicy MomPod wherever you're listening. Following, sharing, rating, and reviewing the show are all completely free ways to support the podcast, and they genuinely make a huge difference. You can also join us over on Patreon. There is a free membership option if you simply like to be part of the community, and if you feel called and are financially able to subscribe monthly, please know that your support matters more than I can adequately put into words. I am a neurodivergent single mama doing my best to build stability and financial security for my family while creating something meaningful in the process. Every paid subscriber helps me continue making this podcast, continue having these conversations, and continue working towards a future where I can eventually turn around and help other women who are rebuilding their lives too. This community exists because of you. It exists because people continue to show up, listen, share episodes, join discussions, and support one another. And for that, I am endlessly grateful. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. And thank you for continuing to help grow this little community we've created together. Take care of yourself and take care of your nervous systems. Ta-ta.